Hey everybody, my name is Tisha Hadra, and I'm here with my fellow C4SO clergy person, Drew Henley. I know that race and racial justice are really important topics, both in light of what scripture demands of us, but also in light of everything that's going on right now in our nation. And Drew recently tried a resource called Be the Bridge that he found really helpful in his church. And so, I just wanted to have a conversation, just chat with him a little bit about how that went, what worked, what didn't, maybe get to know a little bit more about Drew's story. And our hope is that in the course of our time together, that you might pick up a few tips that you find helpful in bringing the issues of race and racism to the forefront in your church context. And so, why don't we just kind of get down to it? So, Drew, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and the church where you serve? I'd really love to also hear about your own experience and background with race and racism.
Yeah. Tisha, so good to get to do this together. And before I say anything, I would love to just recognize like we could talk for hours about this, and Tisha and I
Yes.
have had lots of long conversations. So if I say anything, speaking to you, the audience, if I say anything where you're like, oh, I would love to learn more about that, or that I wasn't perfectly clear, like feel free to reach out to me. My email is drew at redeemeratl.org. But a little bit of background on myself. I grew up in the Atlanta area, and I grew up in the north suburbs, and kind of racially speaking, a predominantly white neighborhood to a all-white church, maybe a couple minorities sprinkled in over the course of our growing up experience at church. And went to a predominantly white Christian high school here in the Atlanta area. From there, graduated and went to Furman University, which is has some racial diversity, but not a ton, up in Greenville, South Carolina. But while I was there, I'd become a Christian in high school, but while I was at Furman, the Lord just really pushed some scriptures kind of in front of me about Matthew 24 and 25, Isaiah 58, a lot of scriptures about justice and what it looks like for us to care for the overlooked. And so from that point, my wife and I, we actually moved into downtown Atlanta, just south of downtown, in a predominantly Black neighborhood with a program called Mission Year. We were mentored by a guy named Leroy Barber, who's out in Portland now. But we spent that year just learning a ton. First book we read was Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Tatum, who is president over at Spelman here in Atlanta, or was president for a long time. And we just got kind of just thrown in to the deep end as far as talking about race, and privilege, and justice, and poverty, and all sorts of issues that plagued the neighborhood that we lived in. And so we, in a lot of ways, kind of backed into the race discussion and race journey with understanding racism in America and specifically in Atlanta. But we have been a part of predominantly Black neighborhoods since 2005, so 15 years or so. And we have a wife and four kids, and we live just west of downtown, a neighborhood called Washington Park, and the church is in the neighborhood right next door in Vine City.
Awesome. And so I know you serve at Redeemer. And tell us a little bit about the makeup of that church and what it looks like.
Yeah, so we planted Redeemer 6 years ago, and we had been in the neighborhood, gosh, in 2008, so about 6 years before that. And so we had just built relationships, and the church was planted out of Trinity Anglican. They were so helpful and supportive of us getting started. And we planted in a predominantly Black neighborhood of Vine City, like I said, that has a rich history in the civil rights era. Dr. King in 1965 actually moved into Vine City. He lived on the same street where my wife and I, when we first moved to the neighborhood, we lived. And when he was assassinated in '68, his family continued to live in Vine City, and they actually still own the home. And so a number of important meetings where they're figuring out bus boycotts, and just kind of with all the leaders getting together at Pascal's and other places around our neighborhood. It was right, we were right in the heart of it, our community was. And so it has remained a predominantly Black neighborhood since then, and had kind of had its ups and downs with different injustices that it has kind of battled through, if you will. But we planted it in 2014, really longing for it to be a multi-ethnic and multi-generational church that was in and for the community. So we talked a ton about what that looks like. We started with a diverse core team, and then kind of had initially some struggles for the church to be as diverse as we wanted it to be. And then we made some adjustments and just kind of grew in trust with the neighborhood over time. We hired another pastor, Pastor Leon McKenzie, who's a fellow C4SO clergy. Pastor Leon, Pastor Mac, we hired him about a year and a half in, and he has been just an incredible gift to our church. And we're so grateful that we get to do ministry in tandem. So we handle most of the pastoral responsibilities together. And then we have a third pastor, Pastor Benjamin Wills, fellow priest in C4SO. Benjamin runs a school called Peace Prep, and also serves as a priest at Redeemer. So he preaches about 4 to 6 times a year and heads our spiritual formation group. So what the church looks like now, so COVID's obviously weird, but somehow we've increased in number in COVID by the Lord's
Wow.
grace. And so it'll be interesting to see what it looks like when we start having services in person again. But we were about 100 or so on a Sunday, adults and kids included, and it's about 50% white and 50% non-white, with the majority of our non-white being Black, and then some sprinkling in of Hispanic and Asian, and a couple Middle Eastern folks. But there's a lot of diversity within the Black people at Redeemer. So there's some that are second generation African, there's some that are Panamanian, some that are Hispanic, Black mix, and some that are like Black Southern American. So it's a diverse kind of small, medium-sized church.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, so I think in light of your story and Redeemer's story, we can probably make some assumptions about the why, be the bridge, why you decided to undergo or to do that class, that group in your church. But I would love to just hear from you. I mean, what's the why? What's the reason that you and the other leaders at Redeemer decided, I think this is something that we want to do as a church body?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we, in essence, even before we planted the church, we have always talked a lot about race. I remember sitting in living rooms and reading articles about race, different aspects of race and racial injustice, and then just having a lively group discussion on it in this 2012, 2013. So it has always been a part of our DNA of what it looks like to be a healthy multi-ethnic church. And so there's been talks, and it's it's regular application sermons. We've had racial unity panels made up of folks in and outside of the church. And so if you've been at Redeemer for any length of time, like you are here for this conversation. Like if you didn't want to be a part of a multi-ethnic church, you just go to another church because they always have toilet paper on the toilet paper rolls, like always have their stuff together when we might not at times. But so you've been a part of this discussion. I think my lights just went out. But we also recognized in 2020, it's just a unique climate that we're in. And so for us, we saw kind of in March, April, after the Ahmaud Arbery killing, that a lot of our African Americans, and not all of them, but a lot of our Black people at Redeemer were just having a really hard time. It just emotionally exhausted. The common phrase "when I was life," and so we heard from our Black leaders saying, "Hey, like we don't want to be the ones that are having to continually educate new white people at Redeemer. We would love for some of the white leaders to really take some of that burden off of us." And as when you're in a healthy relationship, when you're in a healthy friendship, when you're in a
Mhm.
healthy church relationship, you hear from a peer saying, "I need this," and you respond by saying, "Okay, how can we meet that need for you?" And so what we also realized, so that's one aspect. Other aspect is that there's some folks who have been at Redeemer honestly since the beginning. Like our core team, majority of them are still here, and so they've grown a ton. Our white people have grown a ton in the race discussion and just their kind of racial IQ. But we also have newer white people, and we don't know exactly kind of where they are. with their racial IQ, kind of how much they've read, how much education they've done. And so this class was an opportunity to kind of just make sure everybody
Mhm.
kind of understands where we're coming from when we talk about race, and to make sure that they are not only kind of are moved along in the journey, but also understand the vision that we are constantly growing and learning. A quote that you shared with me a couple weeks ago from John Hambrick, the guy that wrote the book with you, about how he came to the realization that as a white person, his eyes had been open to racism, but he was still nearsighted. That has stuck with me, and I've probably repeated it 100 times, giving him credit every time. I haven't taken that one to myself yet.
Good on you.
I want to, but that's the vision that we really wanted our white people to see, and a lot of them, to their credit, have already seen that and are here for the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. John likes to say, I once was blind and now I'm a little nearsighted, right?
That's it.
But
Yeah.
one of the things that I hear you saying that I love is that when you planted Redeemer, you had this bend toward justice as part of your DNA, but you recognize that there's a need to continue to like cultivate that vision over time, because you can't take for granted that just because that's why you planted the church and the people who were there at the beginning were bought in, that people need to continuously be sort of discipled in that, so that that remains a part of the DNA of the church. And so it's something that you have to contend for, I guess. So I really love that you pointed that out.
Mhm.
um, so, one of the things that when I think about, or when I look at when people are discussing topics of race and racism and culture, whether it's on social media or in person, some people often accuse them of being divisive, right? And I bet that there may be a lot of pastors out there who are listening who are afraid or reluctant to talk about race or racism in their churches because they don't want to cause any disruptions in their congregation. So I'm curious, were you worried about creating division in the church or being accused of being divisive just by centering race and racism in this way in your context?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll give you a multifaceted answer. The first thing is yes, there is,
Mhm.
and as pastors, we're lying if we're not honest that we're just scared at times. 2020 has been a year to be a priest, a pastor of a church, and walking through all the different things that you watch churches like splitting up over, arguing about. So it's definitely a fear, but like I wouldn't say it was a huge fear for us, and some of that is for a few reasons. One is that our church, our people have wanted more and more of this conversation. So
Mhm.
it wasn't like it came out of the blue. I mean, if no one was like, oh, I've never heard us talk about this before. So we had kind of cultivated the soil to be able to introduce classes like this, and people, knew that you weren't shocked or surprised by it. The second thing is that when we think about, there's a fear of disunity, or making, efforts towards disunity. I would say, like, for us, when we talk about race, we talk about sexism, when you talk about any of the things that are controversial, those we're not necessarily, if we don't talk about it, what we're doing is we're not creating unity. We're just kind of ignoring a problem. So we're sweeping it under the rug. And so, at worst, what would happen if the more we talk about race, the more we say, oh, we're actually really healthy in this regard. And so, I think about it like I've been married for 15 years, and if my wife says to me, hey, I think we've got an issue in our marriage, I'd like to go see a marriage counselor, like, at that point, the worst that happens is that I go to that marriage counselor and he or she says, oh, like, you guys are actually really healthy in this area. But if I say, no, I don't want to talk about that, I don't think that's a problem, I'm saying, well, it might not be a problem for me, but it's definitely a problem for you. And that's not loving her, by just ignoring that, sweeping under the rug. And the third thing is, like, when we look at Jesus' life, like, the man he did not create division, but he named divisions that he saw. And
Mm.
that's kind of the rhetoric that we want to shift as pastors is saying we're not creating divisions, we're just naming what we see either as divisions that we see or potential divisions in the church. So let's get out in front of this, and so we can really help to cultivate the narrative around what it looks like to be healthy Christians in this regard.
Yeah, I think that's well said. It is a, I don't know, challenging is not a strong enough word to conceive of living a Christian life in a way that doesn't cause any disruption in in culture and in the spaces. I don't even know if we can say that that's the gospel of the New Testament if it's not disrupting, if it's not in breaking and really kind of shaking things up. And so sometimes when we kind of don't want division, I love when you said that we're just trying to sweep it under the rug then, and that there's something really unhealthy
Yeah,
about that. Yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, it may be difficult and it may be challenging. It almost will, you can guarantee it will be difficult and challenging, but that doesn't mean that we ought not wade into these conversations in our churches. So yeah, I appreciate everything that you said there, Drew. you know so I guess for now, I would love to just know more about Be the Bridge. I mean, for those who are not familiar with it, tell us about the format and even the topics that are covered as a part of the class or groups.
yeah. So the Be the Bridge was started by a lady named Latasha Morrison, who's here in Atlanta, and she's just a wonderful woman, and extremely godly. And a lot of other churches had used the material, and so that's kind of where we first learned about it. And so we use a section of their material called Be the Bridge 101: Foundational Principles for Every White Bridge Builder, or for every white bridge builder needs to understand. I think it's the longest title of any PDF.
But you got it right. You got it in there.
But they also have a number of other materials, and their normal groups are for are diverse groups of white and non-white people going through a certain curriculum together. We felt like, given what our Black people had requested, for our white people to kind of go through this on what some of our Black people had requested for them, or white people to go through this on their own, and what I saw as a pastor, especially with our white people, is they felt kind of stuck in that they had questions, they had thoughts on racism, but they didn't want to bring those up to Black people because they didn't know if they were going to be hurtful. And so for us, we wanted to be able to create a space to where they could kind of ask their dumb questions as well, myself included. And that was definitely accomplished. So we took the Be the Bridge 101 class, and it's more or less like 5 or 6 weeks, and we kind of built a curriculum around it. So we added a bunch of extra sermons and articles to kind of supplement it. But we spent the first week just introducing ourselves as groups of 7 to 10, each one of them, just talking about our history as far as what diversity looked like or lack of diversity looked like in childhood, and high school, and schooling after high school, and then up until our present day, kind of what we'd been learning in the last few years. We wanted to put a whole week to just having that conversation. The next week, we talked about some definitions, because we think this is crucial to a healthy conversation, is accurately defining what individual racism is, what prejudice is, what systemic racism is. And so before we got into the material, we needed to make sure that we were understanding those definitions the same way. Language is really important. Then the next week, we talked about white identity and culture. So as white people, we oftentimes think that culture is just for other people, just for our African friends, or our Native American friends, or our Hispanic friends. We'll go to a wedding put on by one of them. We're like, oh, wow, you have so much culture, but we don't think about white culture. And it's very important, because if we don't think about it, we will oftentimes miss how we ask people to assimilate into white culture without even realizing it a lot of times. And so we talked about that for a week, talked about white privilege the next week. So what does it look like for us in America specifically, as white people? What advantages do we inherently have based on historic injustice? These are hard conversations, and just sobering in a lot of ways. But we think it's extremely important for our white people to understand their privilege in order to understand the world, and be able to empathize with the world that our brothers and sisters of color kind of walk through. We talked about white fragility and why it's hard sometimes for white people to talk about race, how our muscles are very small on race discussions because we did not grow up talking about it at the dinner table, like a lot of our Black and brown brothers and sisters. And the last week we talked about white supremacy, which can be a difficult phrase for us to get our heads around, a difficult phrase to swallow. But again, what does it look like for us in America? How often do we how often are we, consciously and subconsciously projecting that the white way is the right way, and how we are looking down at the ways other cultures do things as compared to the traditional white way of the majority culture in America. So we went through those, lots of outside teaching and reading. We required a lot of our people, and they answered the bell there. And then we spent a good bit of time just kind of having a good open discussion.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Sounds very comprehensive, I guess. So, how did it go? What were some of the big takeaways that you saw from the people in your congregation?
Yeah. So yeah, the big things that I saw were I realized how necessary it was to create a
Mm.
space to talk about it. Our people, they were just, and maybe some of it's because of COVID, they're just itching to talk to anybody because
Right.
about anything. But like our folks were just so grateful to be able to process through stuff and they realized like there's a million resources out there on race, and it was helpful for us to be pastoral and saying, here, like, eat this food, this is good food,
Hmm.
whether it's sermons or articles or things to discuss. It also ignore like for us, it's another thing that I saw is that this is a long process, and we've known this for a long time. And I think there's a fear. One thing that keeps priests from moving forward in this is they think they've got to, create the perfect study or the perfect talk on race, and then it's like, all right, well, now I've said everything needs to be said, and we can,
Hmm.
be done with this. We've realized like this is a forever process until Jesus comes back, of us learning how to love each other well. Just like my marriage didn't end, I didn't stop learning because I went to a great conference. I didn't stop learning because I went to, marriage counseling once a month for a year. Like I will until, for the next 60 years, I hope to learn how to be a better and better husband to my wife. And that's what we want to learn, how to be better and better brothers and sisters to each other. So that's some things that normalize. And the third thing is how crucial humility is to this process. Like we have got to admit that we were once blind and now we're nearsighted. Like John said, like we have got to admit that there is so much that we're still learning. And as a white person, I am a testimony to this. Like I remember when a Black Panther came out a few years ago, and like all of my Black friends are like just up in arms about how incredible that experience
Hmm.
was to see Chadwick Boseman up there as Black Panther, and they are getting dressed up. They're seeing
Hmm.
it like 7, 12, 15 times. And I remember as a white person being like, I don't understand. Like, I don't get it. Like, I want to
Yeah.
understand. I'm here for it. I don't understand. But the more I listen to people, the more I was like, oh, this is why this representation is so important,
Hmm.
because you need to talk about their childhood and not ever seeing a Marvel character that looked like them. And I'll get emotional thinking about this, but like how important that was for them, but also just like how like humbling it was to be like, oh, I don't get this, but now I want to keep learning. And then the people, I mean, I'll give some quotes because we did a survey after it.
Hmm.
Some of the quotes was, I was stretched in sharing of vulnerable ways I've stumbled and misstepped when it comes to race relations. So for just to create a space where people can be like, I messed this up. Because there can be such a pressure we put on ourselves that we always and forever like never like say anything wrong in regards to race. And we have this mindset that we're either racist or we're not racist. And the reality is like every person that's ever walked the face of the earth has been affected by sin, other than Jesus, has been affected by the fall, and therefore, like we have a tendency towards racism. And if you grew up in America as a white person, you've been trained whether it's 1% or 100%, two, think of white people as better than other people. And so you've got a lifetime of unlearning and relearning, and let's normalize that. Let's normalize that process. Otherwise, we won't talk about it. So that was great. There are ways that I was privileged that I never considered, was another quote. It was most helpful to think through where the roots of my white fragility come from and hear other white people acknowledge that it's hard to sift through. So normalizing kind of the complexity of this struggle. Another person said, I thought I was the only one who grew up around mainly white people. And both of my groups that I led, every one of our white
Mm,
people grew up around only white people, except for one had like a diverse childhood. And that's a sad reality, but
right.
let's just, operate from the reality that we're in. Stretched in ways to talk about these things. Stretched in, our 6 weeks, this person said, I believe that the curriculum gave me an opportunity to use useful vocabulary to help me explain thoughts and experiences. So putting just some tracks to run on for people. And a lot of people said that, I'll end with this. A lot of people said that they felt like after the class, they kind of had a framework to have more discussions
Mm,
offline about race that they felt kind of hesitant to have maybe before the
yeah.
class.
I love the picture of the interaction between humility and vulnerability, both in your sharing, Drew, but also in the comments that were made. There's some interplay between those two things that feels pretty important. And I just wanted to name that. Um, I know that I'm conscious of our time, but I would love to hear as we kind of move toward the conclusion, about your experience as a leader in your church and how being a part of these groups may have shaped the way you think about leading in your context, especially in a multi-ethnic church in an area of the city that is so steeped in the history of the civil rights movement in Atlanta. I'm just curious about how this group may have impacted your own leadership.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was talking to a fellow C4SO clergy member recently about race in her church, and she just kind of admitted, which I'm so thankful for. She's like, I really don't know where our church is in regards to race. I don't know if how here for this conversation our people are, and I think that that's a normal thing to kind of feel sometimes as a pastor, especially in the pandemic. We don't get to see each other as often as we did beforehand. But for me, it was very helpful in getting a better gauge on where our people are. And in a lot of ways, in Redeemer being a multi-ethnic church with, the other two pastors are Black, and we have a diversity of leadership at Redeemer that we are so thankful for. Our staff is 5 Black and 3 white. Like, there's a lot of diversity at Redeemer, and I'm so grateful for the growth that God has brought to us. And so in some ways, it was very affirming to kind of see our people are here for this. They're willing to sacrifice. They're willing to give away power. They're willing to submit. They're willing to ask the hard questions of themselves, while also seeing we still have a long way to go. Like, we still have got plenty of growth that needs to happen. And though on a Sunday morning, if you came to Redeemer, if we were doing live services, you'd walk in and see, young, old, undereducated, overeducated, white, Black, Hispanic. It's a beautiful picture of the kingdom. It doesn't necessarily mean just because we look diverse that we are healthy in our diversity.
Mm,
And that healthiness is just like our own physical health. Like, just because I'm in, someone's in great shape right now doesn't mean 3 years from now they're going to be in great shape. It means they have to keep eating well. They have to keep getting their rest. They have to keep exercising, keep taking care of themselves. And that was really eye-opening to me. I was like, we can't, we have to keep going forward in this journey and can't kind of rest on the fact that we've made it this far.
Yeah, I love that. That's so important. Both sort of recognizing the need to continue to lean in and press into these conversations, and also to not settle for just the outward appearance of diversity, but to really contend for justice within sort of the confines of your church body, and of course out into the community in which the church is situated. I also found it really, I love when you said like there's all these really beautiful things about our community, but those are the same things that also make it hard, right? That being diverse is really beautiful, and it's this picture of the kingdom, the already and the not yet is sort of embodied right here. But those are make it hard, it makes it challenging as well, because we have to sort of struggle sometimes to understand one another, and we're always learning and growing and trying to figure out how to be better. um, well, so as our time kind of comes to a close, man, I have so many more questions. I think we could continue talking about this topic for so much more time, but I just want to give you an opportunity. Drew, is there anything else that you really want to share about the experience, or just anything on the topic before we close
Yeah.
out?
Yeah, let me think. Two things come to mind. One is I'm unbelievably grateful to be a part of a diverse community. To have my kids grow up, and our Redeemer Kids coordinator is a PhD that teaches at Kennesaw State, and a Black woman who is Nigerian American. And for my kids to be able to have her, that they adore and look up to, like it is a gift to be able to do church in a diverse community alongside diverse people. So A, like I can't emphasize that enough. And then B, like speaking directly to the clergy, I would say like I hear from a lot of them saying like I want to grow in this, I want to learn. I'm so grateful for that. And I would say like just remember that we can't take our people somewhere that we are not already at. Like we
Mhm.
cannot lead someplace where we're also not going. And so if we are going to be here for this conversation, our priests, our deacons, our clergy have got to be willing to do the hard work of understanding racial injustice in our country, of having Black and Brown mentors that we can submit under, that we can learn from, being willing to be shaped by not just white European theologians, but by theologians of color all throughout, currently and throughout history. Like we have got to be willing to not only model this, but have it really sink into who we are as Christians and as leaders. And then out of that, we will be able to lead our people into a healthy place and lead our churches into a healthier place in terms of diversity.
Yeah. Man, Drew, I just want to thank you so much for taking this time out to talk with us about Be the Bridge and how that went at Redeemer. And I just wish you many blessings as you continue on this journey personally, and as a leader, and for your church as you kind of walk out this road, this journey of embodying the coming kingdom. So thanks for that. It was really a pleasure.
Amen. Thank you, Tisha.
Yeah, thanks, Drew.